There is so much out there to get mad about. Social injustices, class warfare, continued colonization, the active destruction of our planet by those focused on profits and not people. We can find it overwhelming at times. The good news is there are equally as many, if not more, stories of people coming together and rising up against the forces at play. So the creators of Blueprints of Disruption have added a new weekly segment, Rabble Rants, where we will unpack the stories that have us most riled up, share calls to action, and most importantly, celebrate resistance. Welcome. Can you introduce yourself to the audience?
Okay. Hello, Jessa. My name is Moe Ramadan. You can call me Muhammad or you can call me Mo. Majority of my friends and family call me Mo. Lebanese, moved to Canada in 2019. I'm a teacher by trade, by choice, a science teacher. I'm a leftist in all of my thinking and life and love and relationships, and an activist, a photographer, a lover of art, and a lover of Palestine. Lebanese by birth, Palestinian by soul. That's what when people ask me if I'm Palestinian, that's usually my answer. I was like, no, I was born and raised really close, but that border that was drawn by foreign forces does not really separate us.
We didn't cross the borders crossed us.
Crossed us, yeah.
You can't see Mo, but he's wearing a keffiyeh, and we will be talking about Palestine. Mo's joined me here for a rant. Recently, Lebanon has entered the fray in terms of talking about Israeli armed forces and their aggressions. Most recently, a Hamas leader was assassinated by the IDF.
Yeah, I was going to say executed, assassinated.
Language matters, right?
Yeah.
You hear me carefully crafting my words as I do this. In Beirut, or around Beirut, which is in Lebanon. And for those who've been paying attention, we know that this isn't the first time Israel has struck within Lebanon or Syria or within other nations under the guise that it's defending itself. I think two things kind of come up as this event happens, right? People start looking at Lebanon even more. I know this is not your first time carefully watching that particular part of the region as being Lebanese and your family over there. I mean, I know you've had your eyes glued, but I think a lot more people now are looking, and they need some explanations. They want to know what's happening, why did this all start October 7th kind of deal, which we know it did not. So you're a good person to pull into the studio here with your knowledge and lived experience with Lebanon. I bet you Santiago is disappointed he's not here. His family's also from Lebanon.
Yeah. He's got a good history too, and through his dad and through living, and what I'm guessing his dad grew up in Lebanon, right?
It is, yeah.
Yeah. So I was born in 1986 in the middle of the Lebanese Civil War, which started in 1973. Prior to my birth in 1982, the Israeli military had invaded Lebanon, bombed and invaded from the south of Lebanon all the way to the capital Beirut. They invaded in the hopes of fighting off the Palestinian resistance that they had pushed out of Palestine, with the help of the right-wing factions in Lebanon and other regional forces. A few years post that, obviously Lebanese resistance started to form, be it the communist resistance, be it the liberation fronts in Lebanon, which led to the pushback against the military invasion of Lebanon. The Israeli forces were kept towards the south part of Lebanon. They pretty much created a fenced-off south part of Lebanon, and they stayed there till the year 2000. If you are aware of what happened, or if you're not aware of what happened, from 1982 onward, especially in the 90s onward, the Lebanese Islamic resistance, or what you would hear called as Hezbollah, started to organize and started to grow in fighting Israeli military and their bases in south of Lebanon. It's a guerrilla war that they fought for all these years, and it was capped off in 2000 by pushing the Israeli forces completely out of the Lebanese borders and liberating the occupied Lebanese territories to 99%, 98%. We still have some Lebanese territories that are occupied in the south of Lebanon. They're the Sheba farms, we call them the Mazara Sheba, which are historically Lebanese villages that are still currently under Israeli occupation. So if we want to talk about like United Nations demarcation line, or like the actual borders of Lebanon and North Palestine, those villages lie within the Lebanese borders, which are still under Israeli occupation. So this is just historically, up until 2000, our liberation from Israel. In 2006, Israel waged a war on Lebanon, which is known as the July War, the 33-day war, whatever you want to call it. That was its biggest military operation post its exit from Lebanon, post its push from Lebanon.
So before we get to current events, I want to dig in a little bit to the 2006 July War.
Yeah.
Because you describe it as an Israeli aggression. That's not how most listeners would have been told the story. And if you check most of your kind of mainstream sources, it is written very similar to the narrative that surrounds October 7th, that particular conflict began on a very specific day where Hezbollah soldiers crossed the border, took hostages, IDF soldiers, and brought them back into Lebanon as leverage to release other prisoners. So right away, we know obviously the conflict didn't start then, because you already have incurred political prisoners that need freeing, which is very similar to Hamas's motivations, which, someone can discuss and argue, to have political prisoners freed, right?
We call them political prisoners, but the reality of it is that a lot of these prisoners are civilian prisoners that have been taken without really any reason to take them. So, and they've been kept under military occupation, like under military detention.
That's an important distinction to make, because it does imply, a guerrilla militia figure, a political prisoner, and that's definitely not always the case.
No, and some of them were resistance fighters. Some of them were leader figures or religious figures within the frame of the Lebanese Islamic resistance. Some of them weren't. Some of them were just villagers who were in the south, who were just abducted for just being there.
Another one of the narratives that surrounds 2006 conflict between Lebanon and Israel is that it is a proxy war. And in this region, proxy wars are not new, right? Typically, we're talking about between the United States and Russia. But in this case, it's implied that it is between Israel and Iran, and that anything bad that happens in the region is surely funded and sponsored by Iran. What do you say to that positioning? Because you call that a war of liberation.
I find it silly that we have to look at it from a very Western lens of proxy wars, when we want to refuse to look at, for example, why would we want to look... Okay, I'll reorganize my words a little bit better. Why would we want to look at it as a proxy war in terms of Iran funding, let's say, and helping out one element, but we want to refuse to see that, for example, the US or Western allies are funding vigorously and like with no checks their arm in the region, Israel. I don't see it as a proxy war. I see it as a war of resources, as a settler colonial war. We've talked about wars of liberation. These are nations that have been occupied over and over and over again. From the time like post-Turkish Ottoman Empire to the establishment of the current Palestine, Lebanon, Jordan, Syria maps, which were divided by the Brits and the French. They were not left to be decided upon by the indigenous people who lived on those lands, because there's a big argument in the region for a greater Syria, for example. You still talk to socialists in Lebanon who would talk about the greater Syria region, which is geographically the Levant, which is Lebanon, Syria, part of Palestine and Jordan. Like it's not. I don't like to talk about it as a proxy war. And I say that because I grew up there, because it is more personal to me than just sitting out and talking about these wars on a foreign land and how they're just part of a Cold War, part of a proxy war.
I think that's the purpose, though, right, of them pushing that particular narrative. One, because everyone quite quickly sees Iran as a bad guy, whereas the war of liberation, we understand that differently. Those are the good guys. And so it also belittles the liberation movement and the fact that it even exists, like as though people don't rise up on their own with assistance, but driven from a need for liberation and a just right for liberation. And a proxy war just is so much easier to dismiss and then shape further narratives around, especially when you start talking about a regional conflict and the involvement of U.S. troops, right? It becomes almost automatic every time the idea of Iran being involved. And so, like, to be fair, I think most people do look at U.S. interventions as proxy wars, like what they do in training militia and arming Israel. I think most people do see it that way, but trying to paint these wars of liberation, because you get the same comments being made about Hamas, that it is simply just an extension of Iran and all the credit for any advancements and funding and everything just kind of goes to this one state that they've spent so much time demonizing, that it's just like the go-to card, regardless if it's grounded in any context, because we know that's part of revolutionary movements, right? Aid by other states. Cuba is famous for this. And guerrilla warfare often relies on, training from experienced revolutionaries. So either way, I ask you about these narratives, hopefully not to further it, but for folks listening that are going to hear these narratives and then be able to deconstruct it from from your lived experience, right? Rather than just scoffing it off. Because I think, the war for liberation, and every time we talk about Lebanon and its relations with Israel, one can't help see the parallels with Gaza, with Palestine.
We owe it big time, I think, to Palestinians and to the Palestinian diaspora to have changed over the last 90 days a lot of the way we speak. Like, I grew up in Lebanon talking about the Lebanese resistance. The term resistance and how uncomfortable it makes people feel here in the West. Like when you talk about Hezbollah as a resistance movement or Hamas as a resistance, right? You want to dissect about, or you want to talk about like how they're bad guys or how it's a terrorist group. The challenging of the narrative in terms of terms that we use to describe these movements as a resistance to the occupation forces is something that has been very costly to Palestinians and I think the Palestinian diaspora knows that it's so very costly, yet they have not been silenced, and yet they have refused to let go of using those terms.
Sometimes, as an armchair observer prior to October 7th, you would see some of the use of words. Martyr is another use of language there to refer to someone killed by the Israeli forces, civilian or soldier. And, there's probably other examples that in your mind, you go, that's risky. That's risky language to use.
You'd go that because of how you've been taught, or the narratives you grow up hearing here.
Not just that, like, as someone who's worked in politics, you understand that, like, sometimes your language should be measured, right? You're trying to encapsulate as big a crowd as possible, so you don't want to alienate people. Like, there's other thoughts involved, but I was just, once you kind of got to October 7th and realized that any form of resistance was now going to be, like, really criminalized, it was going to, like, we saw that reaction, and that's, for me, that's why I asserted myself right from the beginning, is like, this is a right. I don't condone civilians dying, but this armed resistance is a right. This is not a criminal act up on face. It became clear to me why that language had always been important, but I was naive, right? And I didn't criticize them for it. I'm hopefully a better ally than that. But in my mind, sometimes I'm going, ooh, wow, that, it hit you a different way when you'd read it, and you would know which groups were using this language and which groups were maybe trying to do what I was talking about, being a little more broad, being a little more delicate with the settlers.
So I'm gonna take from what you just said. I'm gonna take a point that talks about when you mentioned, like, having to talk about, like, we don't condone the killing of civilians, right? And I'm going to ask a question to the audience or to listeners, and it's like, if we were to look at the resistance movement in Lebanon or the resistance movement in Palestine, and to look at the target of their resistance, who are they targeting in their resistance? Are they really going after civilians in a vicious way, or is there war against the military occupying machine? Will there be civilian casualties in that process? War is ugly. Liberation wars are not something cushy. They're not a piece of cake. They're not something comfortable to engage in. And yes, there'll be civilian casualties, right? But what is the target? Versus when you look at the settler occupying forces in Israel and their targets and the way they go about their military missions, be it in Lebanon or be it in Palestine. The casualties are the civilians on that end, way more than the resistance they're trying to fight, or quote unquote the terrorist organization there, and I use the word terrorist from their point of view.
I won't argue that, and it gets really complex too when you look at the act of settling.
Yeah.
The act of settling. Like, I think, I'm not trying to remove myself from any responsibility, but I think there's a difference in this moment of, and maybe I will regret this and rethink this, but between, like, Canadian settlers and Israeli settlers that are continuing to violently encroach on land. But on the other side, when we talk about guerrilla warfare, and that is I do enjoy reading that book, written by Che Guevara, and civilian deaths are to be prevented for not just, like, moral reasons, but also strategic reasons. War is dirty. In all wars, civilian deaths are very high. Che Guevara writes about the need to win over the populace. So it has a bit of a different application when you are talking about a civilian force that is recruited into the army and that is actively settling against your cause. The Cuban Revolution was done in a way that liberated the people in the territories the guerrillas needed to pass through. But still, I still feel grounded in saying that in any kind of war for liberation, the goal should still be to avoid civilian deaths. But it's not my role ever to second guess acts of resistance like this. And in this fog of war that exists, particularly around this conflict, there's it's not even fully understood exactly how everything unfolded or the motivations or the plans. So, and that becomes almost besides the point because it's still always framed as this insinuating or this initiating event, which it is not. It is a response to severe oppression and violence. And again, you can speak to some of the similarities that the people of Lebanon have been experiencing, like not just in the occupied territories, but the impact that both of those wars that we've referenced have had on the people of Lebanon over all these years who are still, so now you've got we're moving into modern times and you're going to lead here because you know more, but I want to just kind of throw in that it's not just the leaders of Hamas that were targeted in Lebanon. The U.S. intelligence has reported that they have hit many Hezbollah targets, many civilian targets, and they've also hit the LAF targets, which is really upsetting the Americans because that is the U.S. trained and backed alternative that they'd like to have for. And again, this is just a mirror of what they're attempting in Palestine. And I'm sure we can name many other states where.
Yeah, so we'll talk the Lebanese armed forces who have lost, and I'm going to say martyrs, because their job is their purpose as an armed force is to protect your borders. In the south, for us, is to protect our borders from the Israeli occupying forces.
To ensure the sovereignty of the Lebanese people, right?
To die in the line of duty is kind of the definition of your martyrdom there. And they've, the Israeli military forces have targeted Lebanese armed forces, the Lebanese army forces one of the bases a few weeks ago, multiple times, killing, I think, not just one, I think more than one officer on duty or soldiers. But again, the Lebanese armed force is a weakened military force that is, like you said, the alternative solution that the U.S. is trying to provide. But we're talking about a Lebanese armed forces who still have tanks from the 1970s, whose all their modern gear is decommissioned gear that's from the U.S. that is no longer allowed to be used in the U.S., that is now donated or sold.
Okay, so when I say U.S. trained and backed, we're not talking about Israeli style U.S. trained and backed.
See, there's a big difference between a German, let's say, military that goes and trains in the U.S., or an Israeli military that goes and trains, or a Canadian military that trains in conjunction with the U.S. military, versus kind of like throwing your crumbs and leftovers and saying we're training you and we're providing you with help.
Because there's much to be said, and people have argued, and there's evidence, that Benjamin Netanyahu funded Hamas, or at least encouraged its development, and that...
In a divide and conquer move.
Absolutely. And so there's a vested interest in kind of having a continued struggle rather than a clear winner. And this is, again, equally applied to Palestine and Lebanon. And so I think people can start to see why there has been so many rocket launches from Lebanon into Israeli territories in response to the siege on Gaza.
So we'll jump into the Lebanese side of this that started to happen at the start of October, the second week of October, when Israel started to bomb the north of Gaza heavily. I think the Lebanese resistance took it upon itself to start targeting military outposts all across the Lebanese southern borders as a way to alleviate a little bit of the pressure. In doing so, it has drawn a huge amount of the Israeli reserve forces and the Israeli military forces towards the Lebanese northern borders. So had it not done so, Israel would have, let's say, sent those forces, or a big chunk of them, to the borders with the West Bank or with Gaza. So by doing so, I think the Lebanese resistance has just taken it upon itself to partake in this, let's say, active resistance.
Someone has to. I hope most people can hear this and understand.
When we call representatives here to force them to ask for a ceasefire, to demand a ceasefire, that's us partaking in an act of resistance to a genocide that we're witnessing. Well, the Lebanese resistance and its military capability is able to target military outposts. And I think in the last couple of days, Hassan Nasrallah, the head of the Lebanese Islamic resistance, aka Hezbollah, talked about the fact that they are intentionally not targeting civilians that are left in the settlements on the northern borders. They are avoiding targeting civilians, although they are fully within the reach of their artillery, their missiles, their whatever ammunition they have. Their target has been on a daily basis the military bases. And Israel has some really big bases along its northern borders that serve as surveillance and drone control, and I don't know all the military terms for all that stuff. There's a few other.
They've launched the blimp. I don't know, people might have seen that. It's a giant blimp that has massive kind of radar capability, completely a gift of the United States military regime.
But it's been trying to just weaken the capability of Israel to engage in an all-out war.
And there's real validity to this because the Washington Post reports that U.S. intelligence is telling Israel that they likely cannot afford to engage in a full-on battle with Hezbollah at this time, with all of the resources going into fucking genocide, that they've left themselves stretched too thin. Now, Israel's reporting that they've ended combat in the north. However, we know that they're just headed to the south, where everyone has been squeezed into a smaller and smaller space to make it easier for them to kill. However, this is just to say those actions by Hezbollah are not fluff, right? They have impact and justification, frankly, right? Because they are actually doing what they're meant to, right? They're making Israel question that northern front a little bit and drawing away genocidal resources.
They're resource bleeding the Israeli military, which is, there's at some point a report that an American ex-military spoke about how the attacks that the Palestinian resistance is doing, when they launched their Qassam rockets, which are cheaply made rockets of a few, $1,000 per rocket, when they launched them onto the Iron, and the Iron Dome has to intercept them, the Iron Dome is spending about $100,000 per interception. So you throw a $1,000 rocket, you get intercepted with 100,000. So then when you throw 100 of those rockets, you're now bleeding into the millions of dollars with every response. It's the the resistance movements in the Middle East are not dumb movements. The level of education that is involved within those movements is insane. You ever get the chance to sit and talk with people who actually are involved in resistance, and you realize the level of education that they have just dedicated to understand what is economic warfare, what is political warfare, what is military warfare. Like, it's just so. It's not just attacking Israel to draw them into a war. No, it's more attacking them into bleeding their resources economically.
And again, like, you see the narrative shaped around, not that maybe those attacks are stupid, but perhaps they're futile, right? And that isn't the case at all. And one of the main tenets of resistance, particularly guerrilla style resistance, is the need to wear down your enemy. You can't meet your enemy head on. That is the purpose of guerrilla warfare.
Well,
If
no,
anyone's
and
not, we didn't really kind of.
It's not two military forces that are equal in capabilities.
That's why they can't meet head on, right? And so sneak attacks and there's a lot of strategy involved, and it's not only applicable in warfare, right? It's how, the way that you describe this is what Lebanon is doing with the resources it has. And it gives validity to the tactics that we're seeing here to make blockades, to shut down Indigo one day at a time, to
talk about
bleed it dry.
to talk about BDS.
Yes, yes. And so, like, everyone has a role to play there, but it is part of legitimate resistance, and it does work, right? In certain circumstances, and learning about previous successes, because guerrilla warfare is not new, right? We had a guest on from the IRA and talking about how everything that they did and built on were previous revolutions from all over the globe.
And we'll talk, I'll throw in a small bone for those who, was it last year that they marched on Ottawa?
The convidiots?
With convoys to pretty much block the economic wheel of the capital.
And the border, right?
Isn't that a form of, technically, in their eyes, a form of resistance, right?
Don't you give them that credit, Mo.
No, but we gotta give credit where credit is due in terms of what it's done. But the dissonance to not be able to see what's happening now on the ground as a form of resistance, that dissonance, that, like, schizophrenia almost.
It's maddening sometimes.
It's insane.
And it's not even a right-left hypocrisy. It's it's not permeated everywhere, and it is. I describe it as the Twilight Zone sometimes. I think I've said that.
It's not right-left whatsoever. Yeah.
I want to go back. Like, I feel like I'm going back to that July war, because the more I read about it, the more it was kind of, the writing was on the wall.
July 2006 for our listeners.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah.
We'll have some show notes in there for folks to do a little bit more digging. But, when you read about it, it also ended, which is really, typical on how we write wars, or definitely how we depict movements of liberation. So there's a definite date that it was ended, but part of the process became a discussion on, who would police the area, a UN resolution was passed to disarm Hezbollah. They were not a legitimate resistance anymore. They, in the eyes of the world, right, that was the result. And hopefully I don't have to draw those parallels where everyone is asking for Hamas to disarm, and then we have Biden and Netanyahu in negotiations talking about who should rule. Right now they're talking about the north of Gaza, because that's essentially been annexed.
Listen, Hamas will disarm, let's say. Someone else will pick up arms within the next 5 years, 10 years. If we want to be realistic.
But Hamas won't disarm. I think that's just empirically impossible the way that what's happened has happened, just like Hezbollah does not disarm. And in the end, the U.S. did not get to decide who controlled.
If anything, the Lebanese resistance has grown stronger from 2006 till now. The U.S. military actually issued a report for its personnel post the 2006 war in terms of, here are the things that we should not be doing, like learn from the mistakes that Israel has done in its war in Lebanon. They clearly stated that Israel lost in every possible way in that war, and Hezbollah has managed to grow from then till now. That's 2006. We're 2024 now, almost 20 years.
But the human toll was huge for. Yeah, no, they didn't learn their lesson, though, or at least Israel didn't learn their lesson, or perhaps this is the intention. You say they lost, but they still, occupied territories. They pummeled parts of Beirut.
Oh, they like the destruction that we're seeing in Gaza is now folds and folds of what also we witnessed in Beirut. But for the density of what Beirut is, so Beirut is about 600 kilometers squared. Really, really small, highly populated because it's not laid out like cities here. There's no homes. It's all apartment building. I like to call it the concrete jungle. It's just apartment buildings. They pummeled the southern suburbs of the city. And when we talk about the southern suburbs of the city, it's like talking about 2-3 kilometers away from you. Like anywhere where you are in Beirut, you're about 2-3 kilometers away, radius-wise, from anywhere. They pummeled apartment buildings down. They were just dropping unguided bombs, end-guided bombs, and vacuum bombs, and just for the sheer point of for destruction.
No. They were trying to get the hostages back, Mo. Right? Wasn't that the premise? That was the major incursion. That was the start of the war.
There's always a reason. When a tantrum is thrown by a child, the ex-child will always find a reason for their tantrum, and they will cling on to that reason as their tantrum is getting wilder and wilder, and as their rage is becoming bigger and bigger.
No, because you're letting Israel off the hook there, because they are not children. They have crafted these situations.
They are the child of their settler mother and father in the West.
But they're also not reacting to outside stimuli. They are creating said. You know what I mean? Like they create the conditions for armed resistance against them, and so that they can use they were waiting. They were waiting for Hamas's next big move to do this, whether it happened on October 7th or whether something happened 6 months later, or maybe it would be like another great march of return.
In the meantime, they were just starving. They already were starving. And like the UN had the report, the United Nations had the report, was it 4 or 5 years ago, about the unlivable conditions in the Gaza Strip? Like, it was already deemed unlivable. This is before any October. It was already deemed.
It's hard for people to go back and remember that, or have time to talk.
I know, it's our short-term memory.
Yeah,
our ability to forget.
Yeah, the blockade on Gaza has been for years, and I can't even remember if I've talked about it on the show, but it includes things like baby bottles and dairy products.
It includes everything for people, like people in the West. People in the West struggle to understand that everything that went into Gaza through the crossing borders on their western crossing borders with occupied Palestine, or on the southern crossing border with Rafah with Egypt, was controlled by Israel. Like, Egypt was not fully in control of what was going in and out. And then when people were like, well, why did they build tunnels out of Gaza? It was like, Would you not build tunnels out of your house if someone just blocked all the doors and fed you through the window one piece of bread every 2 weeks? Like, would you not dig tunnels with your nails to sneak food to your kids? You would.
They would. And that's why it's important to keep people reminding the conditions that existed for so long before October 7th. And I kind of want to go back to the food in the blockades and the unlivable conditions, because not only are the bombs killing people now, but we know that folks are also dying of starvation in Gaza. And this is by design. It's not just because they're surrounded by soldiers and it's just logistically impossible to get food. It's because those motherfuckers have targeted bakeries and farms, and this is on top of the blockade that exists on the entire region. And this is historically how they've attacked settlements as well, by razing olive farms and destroying the trees and strawberry fields. And we've all seen footage of this. And like, famine has been used many, many, many times in warfare, and we're absolutely seeing it again, except this time around, they admit to it. And maybe not in this context, they've explicitly said, we will starve them until they hand over Hamas.
Well, and this is also, and this is where it's more enraging, the fact that we are now witnessing the sheer belligerence, like the just from the politicians to the settlers to military commanders, Israeli military commanders, Israeli politicians, Israeli settlers, Israeli parliament members. The fact that we are witnessing it with our eyes, it's not like they're speaking about this behind closed doors or off the records. It is pretty well documented by their own media, pretty well documented by the world's media, pretty well spread out on every social media, and we are still trying to convince people of the vile and the evil that is the settler state, the apartheid state of Israel. That is what's tiring. This is what takes a big toll on me. Like, why are we still, like, instead of at this point having all of us already knowing that this is just vile, do I really need to convince you with all the evidence that is out there? If you're like, I don't know how twisted or how, I'll go back to the episode of fascism that you guys did a few weeks ago, and maybe that's what it is. It's the fascism that we are now living in that just denies us.
Canadians are kind of our own breed of obliviousness. We have a real kind of vision of what our role is and our persona, and it's usually quite the opposite of what we're doing as a state.
I started reading the Tyler Chipley book that you had the episode about a month and a half ago, about the role of Canada in the world, especially in terms of settler colonial, not just our role as settlers here and the genocide, the ongoing genocide we're still pushing onto the indigenous population of Turtle Island, where it's just our role in the global settler colonial system is just, yeah.
Part of our role we look at as a virtue. And I'm talking about accepting refugees. And now, before we go into this conversation, in no part, one of my favorite t-shirts is, it just says, "Welcome refugees." And I love to wear it around my conservative fucking town. I am of the position that everyone has the right to migrate wherever they want to go, right? I don't believe in borders. Yes, I know they exist. I just believe they shouldn't. Okay? So before we get into that, know that.
But you know what? What? You're not the only one. You know who also has that belief? Indigenous people who have lived here from time immemorial. They are the ones who were welcoming to the settlers when the settlers arrived. Let's not forget that. Right? They didn't take up arms from the start. And it's the same, and it's the same, and it's the same, and it's the same thing for indigenous Palestinians when we go back in history. They were welcoming to the settlers that came, the Jewish settlers that had fled Nazi Europe, but then tables turn and political movements start to grow and Zionism starts to grow and military Zionism starts to take shape. And at that point, you start to take arms. Residential schools here start to happen. Forced migration starts to happen. Starvation and famine and diseases start to happen. And then you take up arms. And at that point, you then get labeled as a terrorist by no one other than the powerful settler.
You take up arms, or perhaps you flee. So, like, back to the refugee question, not to advocate for us not to let the people of Gaza come, but that is a bit of a delicate situation, because I believe this push, there was a tweet sent out by Loki, and he was reporting, I should have grabbed the source there, but Tony Blair has been recruited by Israel to lobby Western governments to take in as many Palestinian refugees as possible. And we ourselves are exploring this. The Canadian government, the cabinet just decided they'll let like just under 1,000 folks who have family here. There's criteria. The fucked up thing about that one, though, is that Israel is doing the security screening. And so I just want to explore this for a second, because I find Israel has put itself in a bit of a conundrum. So in order to complete the genocide, right, they can't literally wipe everybody else out, or at least I'm telling myself that. The goal is to displace folks as well as martyr them. And in order to do that, they do need nations to take them in, because they don't actually want a refugee camp. They want the whole land. They don't want any resistance building. They want these folks dispersed throughout the globe. That's what completes the genocide, because it's really hard to maintain your culture. Although the Palestinian diaspora is a great example of resilience in this, but that's not the point. They deserve to live in fucking Palestine. They deserve to live in a safe Palestine. And I know that doesn't exist, so I understand that people are trying to flee, and yes, there should be safe havens for anyone trying to flee. But for us to latch on to now the refugee narrative and to think that that can absolve us from not stopping this with whatever means necessary, and we will just simply take the victims in, for me, that is, especially coming from the Canadian state, because it's not benevolence. It's never fucking will be, right? It's complicity in this genocide by entering in those agreements that I bet you started well before October 7th. I imagine the taking of as many Palestinian refugees as possible has always been part of the discussion between Israeli diplomats and their counterparts throughout the world. They always want all Palestinians out of Palestine. Clearly, you just need to see the shrinking map, the embargoes, the starvation.
It just doesn't take a smart human being to read numbers. Very basic progression of numbers of the number of indigenous Palestinian, Arab Palestinians, and I'm going to call them Arab Palestinians, not Muslim Palestinians, not Christian Palestinians, not Jewish Palestinians, Arab Palestinians. That is just dwindling.
But I think like Israel's also painted themselves into a corner here, though, right? Well, because they have spent they've spent a long time, but it's not
75 years plus 90 days.
That's a good way of looking at it, because it's like this kind of asterisk in the last 90 days, like it's on hyperspeed of what we've seen for 75 years. But they've really demonized all Palestinians. So now they're in this position of having to beg people to remove and take in Palestinians while painting them as all criminals, as all terrorists, as all worthy of bombs dropping on their homes, right? So how can you turn around and be like, here, why don't you take Hamas, right? Like, because they've sold this narrative that there are no civilians in Gaza. That's, those are things that they've actually said. And so I think, yeah, it's a bit of a delicate situation.
There is no rhyme and reason, and there is no logic to any of their foreign diplomacy, any of their, I don't know. I don't know if it's just those are all signs of a pariah state that's just like a near collapse
I was going to
of.
say that is an essential stage, though, right? Like people kind of gasp when we say that you have to politically isolate Israel, right? It sounds like you want to erase them, and I'm not going to like get into the fact that an ethno state shouldn't exist,
We're talking
but
about a
it's
state.
important
We're
to
not
do.
talking about a people. Let's stop.
If
Let's
I have to
stop.
repeat
Stop
that for
feeding
my
people.
audience, I'm assuming they're not listening anymore.
Yeah, exactly.
Don't worry.
Exactly. Like
But yeah, it's
we
it
did that. We did that. We did that not a long time ago with an apartheid state in South Africa.
absolutely, absolutely. And I you always read and people we've told each other, and I felt warmth when people would say like all tyrannical, violent regimes fall. But we can't rest on that, right? They don't fall on their own. They fall because they create the conditions with which resistance is inevitable. It is the only logical choice for people. And so when they get so terrible for so long, then you have created inherent resistance within people and resilience. And so it becomes even more difficult. But
Just so
yeah,
we're gonna go back to go back because we had started talking about the July war in Lebanon, the 2006 war, and I forgot. I think we drifted off.
that happens when you have ADHD.
Yeah, so we were talking about the destruction and 2006 that we witnessed in Lebanon. That again, what I'm seeing in Gaza also is very similar to that destruction that I witnessed with my own eyes happen in Lebanon. And I was there in 2006. Like I was not far. I was about 1.5 kilometers from the southern suburb of Beirut. I was displaced out of my home, but I purposefully moved out of my home to go help with internally displaced refugees. There was, I think, about 1.2 million internally displaced refugees in the 2006 war that moved from the south of Lebanon towards the central and the north side of Lebanon, that were taken into public schools all across Lebanon, into homes, public spaces, wherever possible. So I left my house and I helped with a whole bunch of my Scouts leaders. At that point, I was part of the Lebanese Scouts movement, and we took care of refugees in a public school. We had 500 refugees that we were taking care of from 24/7 for the 40 days. It was 30 days of war, but refugees didn't just go back as soon as the war ended, internally displaced refugees. And there's a part of that scares the shit out of me, because I saw it firsthand from my family member who lost homes in that 2006 war, who didn't have homes to go back to. So for the time being after the war, they were still internally displaced refugees for months and months and months at a time, until the rebuilding process started to happen. And now in Lebanon, the rebuilding process started to happen because we still had open borders with Syria. We had open borders in our airport. I don't know what the rebuilding process will look like in Gaza.
If something doesn't happen, there's no rebuilding Gaza, because Israel is annexing it and taking it from the people of Palestine. So if it's rebuilt in their vision right now, it seems like Gaza will be a resort city for Israeli settlers. So although, when I think of the rebuilding of Beirut, and like there have been urban settings that have been demolished in war and rebuilt, you make that point, and Israel is kind of making the point that that's not the plan here. When they say they've destroyed Hamas's infrastructure, they've destroyed all infrastructure. It's
But then they
gone.
play under the agenda. This is a Hamas-run Gaza Strip, and we again will play like this is a Hamas democratically elected government that Israel and the U.S. both agreed that the elections were fair and square, and when they were elected the first time, there's no foul play in those elections. But now
No, the powers that
it's a
be,
destruction. Yeah.
yeah, we're
No,
fine
but
with
the
what was
destruction
happening.
of not it's a scorched land. That's what they're doing. Like they're
Your last statement brought up 2 points that I kind of want to hit before we sign off. But you talked about refugees not returning home right away, and we talk about the delicacy or the delicateness of to leave Gaza or not to leave Gaza. Right, how folks are likely struggling with, not between necessarily armed resistance or leaving, but a variation of sorts. So you have journalists, you have people that, like survivors of the Nakba, have the keys to their home and they want to return. They know and they've experienced generations of permanent displacement. And that must play into their decision on whether to apply for refugee status or not, whether or not to flee if you can, and that's just not an option if you understand the borders of Gaza. It also brought up another point that I wanted to make where I was corrected online in my language that I had used. And it wasn't just nitpicking on my language. We talk about how language is very important. And there was a few times where I referred to the people under siege as Gazans. I know my my accent there is horrible, but it's not my pronunciation that was the problem, even though it is. It's the fact that they're not all from Gaza. Palestine is full of internally displaced people still. That Gaza is mostly a refugee camp.
yeah.
And
that's what I was going to point out, that these are not first-time displaced people. And we're not talking about their families who were displaced. Some of them were displaced in their lifetime once and twice already. Some of these people are originally from the north of occupied Palestine that have just been driven away. Some of them are from the west of Palestine. Some of them are from all across the occupied Palestinian territory, and they've just landed in Gaza because that was the two options. It was the West Bank and Gaza.
So, I want people to kind of close their eyes and imagine that shrinking map. We've made it our cover art. You can't not have seen it. The original 1947 map of Palestine, and I think it should be a little more nuanced than it is, but there's 4 variations, and the shrinkage that occurs is astonishing. And you have to imagine that all of those people in the areas that are no longer labeled Palestine on world maps have either become part of the Palestinian diaspora that you see around you, or they have gone into the West Bank or mostly Gaza, which is why it's so densely populated as well.
Or some of them, we also got to give it to those who are still on those territories with third-class citizenship status with an Israeli. Like, they are Arab Israelis. Like, Israel has granted citizenship to Palestinians who decided to stay, but they are treated as third class, not second class, third class citizens. When we talk about democratic state of Israel, but we refuse to see the injustices of how that state goes about its own internal business, it's mind-boggling.
And that's part of the apartheid argument, like the way that your ethnicity or your religion play part in how much you can participate democratically and the extent of your right of movement in particular. And thank you for reminding me that I had left some Palestinians out of the discussion. But the point is, imagine you have been driven as a person, as a family, as a generational culture. You've been driven to an area smaller and smaller and smaller. And now that is under intense bombardment, a war zone. And now it's like, do you leave knowing the pattern of behavior, knowing Gaza is like the last bit, along with the West Bank, the last bit, hopefully not forever, from the river to the sea. Eventually Palestine will be free. But right now, that's all it is. And if you leave, that's it. You're leaving it to Israeli settlers. And will you ever get it back? Like, it's been many, many years since those original borders have existed, with many attempts to regain some of that territory, right? And so I can't imagine facing that choice as
and it's the urgency
a mother.
Of we either resist now or I don't, there's no waiting. There's no waiting to resist in the future, or to wait, to be hopeful for change in the future if you don't resist now.
Absolutely. You don't want to think about what that or was,
So
did you? You didn't want to finish that.
We always want hope, right? And we always want to cling on to hope. But hope comes with the act of resistance.
That is a wrap on another episode of Blueprints of Disruption. Thank you for joining us. Also, a very big thank you to the producer of our show, Santiago Halu Quintero. Blueprints of Disruption is an independent production operated cooperatively. You can follow us on Twitter at BP of Disruption. If you'd like to help us continue disrupting the status quo, please share our content. And if you have the means, consider becoming a patron. Not only does our support come from the progressive community, so does our content. So reach out to us and let us know what or who we should be amplifying. So until next time, keep disrupting.